forgives all my sins and heals all my diseases, who redeems my life from the pit and crowns you with love and compassion, who satisfies your desires with good things so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. The Lord works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed. He made known his way to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
God, by the power of the Holy Spirit, we ask that you would startle us with your word this morning, O God, and awaken us to your truth for Jesus' sake. Amen. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And when he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he had said this, all of his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So here we have Jesus. He's come to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and this has been a theme in Luke's gospel. The first time that Jesus visited a synagogue on the Sabbath, he unrolled the scroll and read from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." Now this visit to the synagogue on the Sabbath will be his last. His friends are with him. The many followers he's been collecting along the way are there too, and there's barely enough room for everyone. And as he's teaching and he's preaching, sharing intimately about God the Father in his Father's own house, his eyes suddenly fall on a woman. And she's standing, sort of. Her body is twisted, and she's bent over almost in two, and she's all the way in the back, in a corner, by herself. No one else has really noticed her. We don't even know her name. But she's shown up, just as she has every week, sometimes more than once a week, for as long as anyone can remember. Longer than the 18 years she's been crippled by a spirit that has stolen her strength, that has devoured her energy, a spirit that has weakened her so much she's not even sure of her faith anymore. And yet, she still shows up, week after week, month after month, year after year, like her mother and her grandmother and her aunts and her sisters. No one's ever bothered her before. No one's ever paid her much mind at all. She learned a long time ago to watch people's feet and to listen for their footsteps and to stay out of the way. She knows she's broken, unclean, unworthy. She knows she doesn't belong, and yet she still shows up. She never stops showing up. She's a daughter of Abraham. That is what you do. Jesus' voice calling someone is so unexpected it startles her. She's not sure who he's talking to, but he sounds so urgent and so sincere. In fact, if one of his friends hadn't walked over and bent down, being very careful not to touch her, and whispered with exasperation, she wouldn't even have realized he was calling her at all. It took her a few moments to shuffle over to where Jesus was waiting for her. The air was thick with anticipation, hushed voices bouncing off the walls as everyone wondered what was going to happen. Would Jesus send her away? And then his voice filled with overwhelming compassion. Dear woman, you are set free. And after he spoke, there was the briefest of moments. If you blinked, you'd have missed it. But in what seemed like only enough time to take a breath, the woman unrolled her spine and she stood up straight. No one had ever seen her face so clearly before. Not in 18 years, at least. Her eyes were as wide as anyone else's, maybe even wider. And not only did she stand, but she hopped. She gave this little jump, and she let out this large gasp of what could only be described as joy. She threw both of her hands up in the air, and she spun around, and she shouted, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name." And everyone in the room was astounded. They were dumbfounded. They just started to join her, praising God for what they just witnessed, when all of a sudden this other voice rings out. And it was louder than the rest, and there was not an ounce of joy in it. In fact, it was very, very angry. It was one of the synagogue leaders. He was shaking his fist, and he was shouting at them to stop. His brow was furrowed, his lip was curled, and his face was beet red. "This is the Sabbath," he hissed. "Don't you all know any better? Healing is work, and there's no work on the Sabbath. If anyone wants healing, you come back any other day of the week. There are 6 to choose from, but not the Sabbath day." And the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Some of the folks were shocked at his outburst, and others were frightened. They stole glances at one another as they hung their heads and they wrung their hands. Even the woman got lost in the crowd. But Jesus wasn't about to let him have the last word. "You hypocrites, you are the leaders of the synagogue. These folks look to you for guidance and for wisdom, and this is what they get? Putting on a mask and acting holy isn't worshiping God with everything that you have and setting them a good example. God doesn't care what other people think about you. God already knows your heart. God doesn't want any pretend sacrifices. God wants you to know mercy and to show mercy more than any rules that harden your hearts against one another, even rules that are given to you to help you do what is right." You stand there and you are so indignant as you shout that there is no work to be done on the Sabbath, because that is what Moses told your ancestors to do. Keep the Sabbath day and treat it as holy, exactly as the Lord your God commanded. 6 days you may work and do all of your tasks, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Don't do any work on it. But what is the rest of that command? Not you, not your sons or your daughters, your male or your female servants, your oxen or your donkeys, or any of your animals, or the immigrant who is living among you, so that your male and female servants may rest just like you. You loosen the bonds that tie up your animals so that they can get water to sustain them on the Sabbath, but you would refuse to loosen the bonds that tied up this woman for 18 years so she can get healing to sustain her, not just for the Sabbath, but for the rest of her life. God feeds the birds and clothes the flowers. How much more does God long to take care of the sons and the daughters of Abraham, including this woman? If this were your own child, weak and in pain, would you tell them to go away, to leave you alone and to come back at some other time that's more convenient for you to take care of them? Would you have your own child suffer a day longer than necessary? And if any day was a good day to be set free from being broken and wounded, don't you think the Sabbath day would be the best day of all? Do you even remember why God told Moses to set aside a Sabbath day? Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. You all were slaves, the people of Israel, God's people, working 24/7, never getting a break, never taking a rest. Pharaoh didn't care about you one bit, but God saw you, and God rescued you. And God didn't just give you rest for a day. God commanded you to rest once a week for the rest of your lives because God loved you that much. Every Sabbath is a chance to remember that you were once slaves and to give thanks that you had been set free. Today, this woman who was a slave to a spirit that crippled her for 18 years was set free, and she was so thankful she couldn't help but sing God's praises. I don't think you remember the Sabbath at all. If you thought it was quiet before, the silence in the room was deafening now. No one dared to move. The synagogue leader's anger was still simmering, but most of it had turned to shame. He tried to stare Jesus down, but he had to keep looking away. His heart was pounding. His palms were sweaty. He wasn't sure he agreed with Jesus, but he knew he'd been defeated by him. He wanted to stand his ground, but he had nothing to say. And after several long moments, while everyone in the room was still holding their breath, he turned on his heel and he stormed away. And the crowd went wild. They didn't fall at Jesus' feet and tell him how wonderful he was or smack each other on the back and talk about how great it was to see the synagogue leader get beaten. No, they remembered the Sabbath and the woman and the healing, and they celebrated that Jesus had seen her and that she had been set free and that surely the presence of the Lord was in that place. And then they worshiped God. They laughed and they hugged and they sang and they danced. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Praise his holy name. Can you imagine? Can you see it? Can you picture yourself among them? If so, who are you in this story? Who do you most identify with? Are you one of Jesus' disciples, celebrating and worshiping with the crowds, desperately wanting to be transformed, more like Jesus, falling even more in love with this crazy, beautiful, radical rabbi who is the very Son of God and yet still your friend? Are you one of the fringe followers, still rejoicing, but holding your cards a little closer to your chest? Not completely convinced that Jesus is who he says he is, but more than a little intrigued by him and wanting to know more. Are you one of the synagogue leaders, wanting to keep things the way they've always been, preferring the safety of rules and tradition and order, and not so sure about Jesus letting in all these sinners and strangers and Gentiles and all the rest? Are you like the woman, on the margins, on the outside, stooped over with worry, crippled by a spirit of brokenness and woundedness and otherness, believing that you are unlovable, unforgivable, unredeemable, unnoticed, and unknown? If you are a disciple, be encouraged. Jesus is exactly who he says he is. And he has commissioned you to do and to say and to live and to love as he has done and he has shown you to do. Keep going and keep telling the story of what God has done in your life. If you are a fringe follower, go deeper. Jesus is exactly who he says he is, and he will keep pursuing you for the rest of this life here on earth so that you can spend eternity with him in heaven. You'll want to know him better before you get there. If you are a synagogue leader, don't dismay. Jesus is exactly who he says he is, and he needs your rule keeping to ensure healthy boundaries and to maintain order. He boiled them down to 2 to make things easier for you, and when in doubt, hold on to these. If you are crippled by a spirit, take heart. Jesus is exactly who he says he is. And he sees you, and he calls you, and he holds you. He offers you healing even if you don't ask, even if your faith is weak, and even if others don't want him to or don't think he should. He may not cure our bodies, but he will set our souls free. The Apostle Paul always had some thorn in his flesh that he begged to be removed. Jacob wrestled God for his blessing, but wound up with a limp for the rest of his life. Jesus sees us, whoever, however, wherever we are. And he calls us to him, and he promises that if we come to him, all of us who are weary and heavily burdened, crippled by a spirit, he will give us rest for our souls. Good news to the poor, release for the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and liberty for those who are oppressed. Every week when we gather together, we remember the Sabbath. Every week when we gather, we celebrate and we remember what Jesus did for us. And every week we are reminded that it is Jesus who calls us to him, who calls us to meet him in the communion meal. And we are all welcome at that table. In her book, Searching for Sunday, Loving, Leaving, and Finding the Church, Rachel Held Evans challenges us with this observation. She says that what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it keeps out, it's who it lets in. And that includes all of us. Jesus sees us, and he calls us, and he welcomes us all to the table. And as we come in this family of God, in this community of believers, we sing and we pray. Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come brokenhearted, let rescue begin. Come find your mercy. O sinner, come kneel. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. So lay down your burdens. Lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. O wanderer, come home. You're not too far. Lay down your hurt. Lay down your heart. Come as you are. There's hope for the hopeless. And all those who've strayed, come sit at the table and come taste the grace. There's rest for the weary, rest that endures. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. Amen.